Hi, everybody. Welcome to PDE TV. I'm Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach here at Parents Defending Education, and I am very excited for our guest today. His name is Jay Greene. He is a Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policy. I am also proud to call Jay a friend. Jay, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so we are going to talk today about the subject of books, and really more what you have probably been hearing in the news, book bans. And I'm using quotation marks like this because everyone's talking about book bans, and Jay and I are going to talk sort of about why that language is not accurate and help explain what this debate is about, what it isn't about, and why it's become very confusing to people. Particularly because people seem to be using different definitions within the same conversation. All right, so we're going to set the stage for everybody watching. Jay, there's a lot of concern about books. We're hearing and seeing a lot of stories, headlines, rhetoric about parents being concerned about books. So I guess my first question for you is, where do you think this concern is coming from? And what have parents been doing about it?
Sure. So what we're talking about again is what's in school libraries, what books and other content are in school libraries. And for as long as there has been schools, there's been some need to decide what is acquired for school libraries and what is maintained in school libraries. And there have always been controversies about this over time. But for the most part, school librarians and school officials have done a reasonably good job historically of making sure that the collections in the school libraries reflected the values, priorities, and educational needs of the communities they served. And I think the controversy that we're seeing recently is really a disconnect that's growing between the decisions that librarians and school officials are making and the priorities and values of the communities they serve. And as that disconnect becomes more salient, then there are going to be heightened controversies over what is educationally valuable and age appropriate for having in the collections of local school libraries.
Okay, so the average person out there who listens, reads, watches mainstream media sees a headline like this one. And here it says, so book bans are getting everyone's attention, including Biden's. Here's why. Okay.
Right.
I guess, what do you think that a person who sees this assumes is going on versus what is actually happening?
Right.
And also, what is the motivation for so many media outlets to be doing this?
Right. So I think that what people think is that there's some nefarious effort to restrict and limit what it is that would be normally appropriate and educationally valuable for children, and that this is being done by some small cabal foisted on everyone else against their preferences. I think that's the narrative that the media is pushing, and that people, if it were true, might be rightfully concerned about. But instead, I think the actual narrative is that librarians, school librarians, and school officials are at an increasing rate beginning to acquire materials for books that, when communities find out about it, they're objecting to it. And that objection is being called an effort to ban, when really it's just an effort to assert control, to reassert control of the communities over what is really educationally appropriate and age appropriate as well.
Yeah, so on this topic of the word ban, I just wanted to discuss that for a second. So what we are seeing from some organizations, and certainly from the White House, and certainly from the Department of Education, and definitely from a lot of these sort of media outlets, is that they are using the word ban as a synonym for restrict.
Right, for censorship.
Yeah, and so
which would be an attempt to limit it inappropriately, an attempt to restrict what would normally be appropriate.
And it's been interesting because I have literally been standing in my local library looking at books on shelves that I'm on my phone reading an article about how like this book has been banned, and I'm thinking it's right here, or I'm at a bookstore, I can purchase it, or I'm on Amazon and I can purchase it. So to me, and I suspect to you, when I think of a book as being banned, it makes me think that I can't have access. There's no access to this book, um, versus what we're talking about, which is often deciding that a book isn't age appropriate, maybe moving a book from an elementary to a middle, from a middle to a high school, or simply deciding, as we have done for a long time, we've never stocked Playboy and Hustler in the library. Nobody has ever called that censorship. And suddenly we seem to be at a place where maybe some people actually think that that too is a ban.
Right, right. I mean, the very strict definition of ban would be to make illegal to publish or possess a book. And there are countries in the world, many places in the world, where there are book bans, where you can be put in jail and punished if you were to publish a book or to own a book. That is not the case in the United States. The United States has the First Amendment, and so strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a book ban in the United States because it's not illegal to publish or own books. But I think that people have a more reasonable and expansive understanding of ban. That ban could be not just to make illegal, but also to restrict, to make unavailable access to what is appropriate. And so there is such a thing as potentially banning books from libraries if there were an effort to inappropriately restrict what is available in a school library. I guess the whole question then really hinges on what is appropriate, right? What is appropriate to have in a library, a school library, and what is not appropriate, and also what is the process by which we decide those things. And I think the status quo process is that librarians in schools receive a lot of deference, that they just make decisions, and then what they decide is what should go. And if anyone questions that decision or challenges those decisions, then they're being accused of book banning. And I think that's not appropriate. It is completely reasonable for communities, parents to question the decisions of librarians and school officials, to assert that different decisions ought to be made, and there needs to be some reasonable process for adjudicating those disputes. And that reasonable process is called local democratic control of schools, and it's not called book banning. And so the thing that they're calling book banning in the mainstream media is really just normal democratic deliberation. That is, people arguing with each other over what they think is good to have in a library in the school and what is not.
Okay, so one interesting thing, and I think actually the crux of this largely is age appropriateness. That seems to be, I think, what has parents sort of the most fired up. And so the book Gender Queer, which we'll talk about because I think we'll talk about your report in a second. One of the things that we hear is that this book is pretty prevalent in middle school libraries. And yet when people look at it on Amazon, it says that it's for 18 plus.
Right. So Genderqueer is the most banned book, according to the organization PEN America, which is the most frequently cited source for tracking what are called book bans in school libraries. And in our own analysis of PEN America's list of banned books, we agree that PEN America is the most removed book. That is, it's the most likely book to be removed from a school library.
Genderqueer. You mean
Genderqueer? I'm sorry. Genderqueer is the most removed book. Now, Genderqueer might be a perfectly reasonable book for an adult to read. The question is, should it be available on bookshelves in school libraries? And it's a graphic novel in both senses of the word. It's graphic in the sense that it is a cartoon book. That is, it has drawings, comic drawings, and narration like a comic book. But like a lot of graphic novels, it's adult content drawn in comic book form. And it's graphic in that it depicts sex acts in those drawings. And that's why you would see it marked as 18 plus as the age range intended for the book on something like Amazon, and why it is, to be expected that parents in many communities might object and say, this is not the kind of thing that we want our schools to have on their library shelves. Now, that doesn't mean that the content is evil or wrong, or that the issues that it addresses are illegitimate. It simply means that there's a certain line of graphicness, literally, that some parents just don't think ought to be crossed. And these are not prudes. They're not, unreasonable people, and they're allowed to object. Just because their school librarian decided that this was a good thing to acquire doesn't mean that everyone has to defer to that decision. People are allowed to say, I think you're mistaken in having acquired this book. I think you should reconsider and remove it. And that's exactly what's happening out there, is people are asking the school boards to reconsider the decisions of the librarians. And in many cases, the school boards are agreeing with the parents. And if the school board, the elected school board, agrees with the parents and overrules the decision of the librarian, that is not a ban. That is democratic deliberation, adjudicating in a reasonable process what's appropriate to have in school libraries.
So it seems like there's been a trick played here where, because many of these books are also in the genre of LGBTQ, right? It's that they're trying to paint the parents and other community members who object, that, as people that are only objecting because of their bigotry, instead of objecting because of the graphic nature of the illustrations. And it seems like no matter how many times these parent groups and even religious leaders will come out and say, we would object to this content regardless of the kind of relationship being depicted, it's the graphic nature of it. It does seem that many media outlets, again, the White House, the Department of Education, they really have in ways been successful at convincing people that this is coming from a place of bigotry and hatred and phobia. What do you think about that?
So I think parents would be as likely to object to Hustler as they would be to genderqueer, right? I think the main objection here is to the visual depiction of people engaged in sex acts. I think that's the fact that those sex acts are between people of the same gender or different genders is not the main issue. I think librarians have felt emboldened in recent years to acquire more works that have visual depictions of same-sex acts because they see this as important. But just because librarians have made that kind of differential decision to acquire more works depicting same-sex acts doesn't mean that the objection to it is an objection to same-sex as opposed to just sex. And look, parents are not objecting to homosexual authors. No one is objecting to Walt Whitman. No one is objecting to homosexual content within literature. No one's objecting to, let's say, Lawrence of Arabia. People are specifically objecting to the visual depiction of sex acts, mostly in graphic novels. Some of those are same-sex sex acts, and some of them are heterosexual sex acts. But I think it's really the fact that it's visually depicting sex itself that is the main source of the objection for many parents.
Yeah. One parent described it to me too as the vulgarity. They just feel like that with many of these books, they're newer books. They were published, sometime after, I don't know, let's just say 2000, 2012. And there is sort of a lower level of writing, a lot more profanity. And so they're also seeing it as, gratuitously vulgar. And the books that I've looked at, I actually think that they do make a really good point in terms of that as well. So even if there aren't graphic illustrations, they find the text to just be like really riddled with profanity and vulgarity. in
Right.
ways.
Some of this is like a response to a therapy culture. So there are a lot of people who think that lots of unpleasant things, including being molested as a child, or discomfort with sexual content as a young person, that these need to be kind of worked through in some sort of therapeutic way. And so acquiring more works that focus on that content is something that librarians have given greater priority to, and authors have given more priority to in the last few years. And as parents have begun to notice it, they've begun to object. Now, frankly, there is local control over these matters, and in some communities, they feel like these are the kinds of works they want to have in their school library, and that's fine. They are allowed to decide to draw the line in a different place in different localities. What we don't want to have is a national imposition of a single standard.
Right.
And we also don't want the unchecked authority of librarians to rule the day. Right. Librarians don't get to decide everything that our children are exposed to. We have a say in it too, and we get to debate that in front of a democratic entity like a school board, and ultimately it's that democratic entity that has to make a decision, not the librarian. The employee of the school district doesn't get to overrule the school board. But I think that's kind of the worldview of many of these media accounts. What they want is librarians to be able to make decisions and never have them reversed. But parents are allowed to question and convince their school boards to reverse those decisions all the time, just like they're allowed to reverse other decisions of employees of the school district. The employees don't rule the school district, the school board does. And the parents are voters, and they're allowed to have input into that process.
All right, we're going to jump to the report. So your organization, again, the Heritage Foundation, you have a recent article about this in which you cite a report that you did showing that most of the books on the PEN America list that they claim are banned are actually still in those school libraries. So tell us what's going on there.
Sure. So PEN America keeps track of what they claim are banned books, and they define as a ban any restriction in access, any restriction. So if a book is temporarily removed while it's being considered, that book is thought to be banned, even if that temporary removal is a day. If the book is moved from one section of a library to another, or from a middle school library to a high school, that's considered a ban, according to PEN America. So they have a very expansive definition of ban that I don't think is consistent with how most people think of the word ban. I think most people think of the word ban as removal in some sort of permanent sense, that is, it's removed and no longer available on an ongoing basis. So what we did is we took the list of books that PEN America said had been banned from schools during last academic year. They said there were about 2,500 books that had been banned from school libraries. And we simply looked up in online catalogs for those school districts whether those books were listed in the libraries and listed as available. We were able to find 74% of the books that PEN America said had been banned. We were able to find listed as available in the online catalogs of the school libraries in the very districts where PEN America had said the books had been banned. Now, we don't know exactly why all of those books are available. We don't know if they had been temporarily removed and restored. We don't know if they had been shifted from one location in the library to another. We don't know if they had been moved from the middle school to the high school. We don't know if some sort of parental permission requirement had been attached to the book. Those are all things we don't know, but what we know is, as a general rule, those books are still there. Like the vast majority of the books that PEN America says are banned are not banned in any sense that regular people think of the word ban. That is, they're still on the library shelves. They're still available to students. They're still in use. We could see them being checked out and with due dates going forward. And so, the vast majority of the books that PEN America says are banned are not banned at all. They're still available. Now, we can also talk about the 26% that we could not find listed in the catalog that we think may actually have been removed. And those books we might think of as banned in the sense that they've been removed and made not available in the library. But the vast majority of them, almost all of them, again, are works that have graphic depictions of sex. That's almost the entirety of it. So works of fine literature that you hear cited as banned books, almost never are those books actually removed in any way from school libraries. They're all there. Of Mice and Men, Lord of the Flies, Amanda Gorman's poetry. It's all there. It's on the library shelf. That's a complete description of the situation to say those are banned. But the things that are removed include works like Genderqueer or Flamer or Let's Talk About It. These are kind of sex ed books, but with very graphic depictions. Those books have sometimes, but not every time, but sometimes they've been removed from school libraries. And, again, local school boards are allowed to reconsider the decisions of librarians and reverse them and decide, we actually don't think this would be a great book to have on our shelves.
Going back to the Amanda Gorman situation, because I think it might be the one that got the most attention. Yeah. People may remember that Amanda Gorman, if I remember correctly, she was a teen-age young woman. She had written a poem, and she did she read it at an inauguration?
She did. At Biden's inauguration, okay. She recited one of her poems. She's very charismatic, very talented young person, and her book containing the poem that she read at the inauguration was available in a K-8 school in Miami. So that is the situation.
And somebody filed a complaint.
Someone filed a complaint. Now, here's the thing. Parents are allowed to file complaints. They're allowed to raise objections, and they're allowed to be unreasonable. Sometimes, parents raise objections, and the rest of us would look at that and say, that doesn't sound right to me. But they're allowed to express it. We then have to discuss the matter, adjudicate it, and decide. That's precisely what happened in Miami. A parent raised an objection. I think the objection was unreasonable. I think that this is a very fine book that most people would probably want to have in their school. And so the book was in the library in the K-8 school in Miami. They went through their process where the principal and librarian and some other official sat down and reviewed the books that the parent objected to, including the Amanda Gorman book. And they decided that all of the books continued to be appropriate and should all be retained in the library. That is, they decided not to ban any of them. Okay, they didn't agree with the parent's objection to any of the books that she objected to. But they did notice when reviewing the book that the book had been shelved in the elementary school section of the K-8 library, and that its reading level was actually above the 5th grade level. And they thought it would be better to reshelve that book in the middle school section of the same library, in the same school. So anyone can still walk into that library and get any book they want, but they moved it to where they thought it would be better suited to the reading level of the people more likely to be looking at those shelves. And that PEN America called a ban, and that CBS News and the Washington Post all got whipped up and called this a ban. And it's the most ridiculous thing ever because the book was never banned. Yes. In fact, it was never restricted. The Washington Post makes a claim that there's some sort of reading test required to access the book, but there's no corroboration of that claim from anyone, including the school itself, which says that there are no restrictions on access to that book. And so it's not a banned book, but we got a huge news cycle hysteria over this. Amanda Gorman got a lot of book sales out of it. Good for her. But it's just a false account that got people really whipped up. And I think that there's something mischievous about the people spreading these book banning claims, because I think to a large extent they know it's false. They know this book was not banned. They know it, but they think that if they get people really whipped up about book bans, that they'll get more deference for school librarians making unilateral decisions about what should be acquired. And that's the world that they prefer. Well, that's not the world all of us prefer. The world I think most of us prefer is that librarians get to make decisions with review by the elected school board, with input from democratic constituents, including parents. I think that's a more reasonable world than librarians get to decide whatever they want.
Well, I also think that most of us just prefer truth, right? So because to read an article, to think that what happened is terrible, to be upset about it, and also now it leads to see these horrible bigots that are against books because they're anti, LGBTQ. Look, they're also racist. They're against Amanda Gorman's books. And so it feeds into this really ugly caricature that's based in lies. And then it gets hard to pull it back. So by the time the truth comes out, most people only saw the first headline, they heard the first thing, and they probably still think, many people still think and assume that her book is out of the library when it never left the library at all. So
it didn't. And actually the whole process worked exactly as it should. That is, a parent made an unreasonable request. The parent may have had some association with bad groups, I don't know, Nazis or something. Look, there are bad people out there and they make bad requests. But the process worked as it should, which is the school sat down and looked at the books that she objected to, including the Gorman book, and they decided that those books were appropriate and they kept them. And they continued to make them available. They adjusted which shelf they were on simply so they would be age appropriate. But that is not a ban. And it's actually the democratic process working exactly as it should.
Okay. One just interesting thing is right now it seems like all of the attention is at least coming out of, mainstream media seems to basically be saying the people that are trying to get books banned are these conservative right wingers. And yet what's kind of interesting, and I haven't noticed much about this, is that we actually have seen efforts from people on the left and the right to get books removed, but for different reasons. And so can you just talk a little bit about this sort of like the right versus left in terms of book creation? So where we saw the left, wanting Huck Finn gone and To Kill a Mockingbird gone because there's racial slurs in them. The right wants Ibram Kendi's books like Stamped and the book Not My Idea taken out because it teaches white children that they are oppressors. So I guess just something about that. And also your thoughts about why we didn't, I don't remember PEN America jumping into the fray when Dr. Seuss books were being pulled, but maybe they did and I missed it. So just a little bit about what seems to be a double standard in the coverage.
Sure. Again, disputes over what's appropriate to have in school libraries are as old as school libraries. There have always been fights about this. And those fights have, the objections have come from the right and the left. And as you correctly point out, a lot of the objections from the left have been to books that they thought were racially inappropriate, particularly works that included the N-word, including works of literature like Huck Finn or To Kill a Mockingbird. And parents are allowed to raise those objections. They're allowed to raise those objections from the left. They're allowed to worry about whether the N-word is appropriate to have in a work of literature in the school library. And there has to be some process for adjudicating that. For the most part, those books have been retained in school libraries historically, and this has gone back a long, long time. You are also entirely right, Erika, that groups like PEN America tend not to get worked up about those objections. And in fact, at times, PEN America itself calls for censorship, which is really amazing to me. So one of the other main issues that PEN America pushes is they want social media to engage in efforts to combat disinformation. That is, things that PEN America thinks are untrue. They want Facebook and Twitter to censor. Okay, so they're for censorship, but as long as the right people are in control of deciding what's selected. So they like librarians, so they want librarians to decide what you should have with unchecked authority, but they want that same unchecked authority for social media like Facebook or Twitter, as long as those organizations agree with their preferences, as long as disinformation as they view it is censored. But this reminds me of the definition of free speech in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union actually had in its 1977 constitution a protection for free speech. Most people don't know this, but there was a protection in the Soviet constitution for free speech. They just prohibited lying. You couldn't say falsehoods. But this is a lot like the Pen America view of free speech. They want free speech as long as you don't lie, and they get to decide what a lie is. But that's not really, that's an authoritarian type response to disputes over what appropriate content is. And I think people like Parents Defending Education, like Heritage, what we want is local democratic input. We understand that there are always going to be disputes about what we're going to have in school libraries. And we just think that there has to be some reasonable process where all the different stakeholders can express their voice and ultimately have democratic accountability for decisions about what's educationally and age appropriate.
All right. So, Jay, what have I not asked that you were dying to say, or that you think is also crucial for people that are just starting to try to understand, again, this book thing they keep hearing about, but they don't really understand what's going on? But also, before you answer that, one thing I was thinking is, I don't know the answer to this, but I'm not aware if the pushes from the left on the Huck Finn or the Mockingbird or the Dr. Seuss stuff, I'm not aware if those came from parents actually or not. It seems like right now we're in a big moment of parental awareness and parents raising their concerns. I don't remember don't know actually, if those other ones were from parents, though if memory serves, they weren't.
Well, I mean, a lot of people are parents. And so I think particularly the Huck Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, I can remember over decades, and we're talking over decades, objections from some parents. Again, you can have parents who you think are mistaken, who raise objections that you think are wrong or are not considering the context appropriately.
Well, we get those all the time. I mean, what's funny is so we get people submit things to us and they'll say, I can't believe it. My daughter's, 11th grade English class is reading whatever book it is, and again, like, to us, that parent has every reason to dislike that choice, but it's not something that we would ever take on because it's not reasonable.
Well, right. Again, but there has to be some process for adjudicating these disputes.
Yep.
The Dr. Seuss stuff is different, and the Roald Dahl stuff, which we haven't mentioned, is also different in that those came from the publishers themselves. The publishers actually either withdrew certain Dr. Seuss books, or in the case of Roald Dahl, they edited the works to remove objectionable content within those works. And look, some of that content is potentially objectionable, and people might, have reasons to raise concerns about them. But those were decisions made by the publishers of Roald Dahl and the publishers of Dr. Seuss. And school librarians are now, either not carrying the Dr. Seuss books that they can't get anymore, or carrying the revised, updated Roald Dahl without objectionable content. And they're doing that without Pen America or any of these other media outlets objecting to it. So there's plenty of curation going on here from the left. And there's nothing inherently wrong with curation from the left or the right. Again, everyone is allowed to raise their concerns and provide their input. And then ultimately there has to be some sort of democratic process for deciding in what's going to be in a public school. And the same is true with our local library. We haven't talked about local libraries at all. But local libraries are also public institutions, and with all shared resources, we have to kind of share control over what's going to be in them. And sometimes they're going to make decisions we like, and sometimes they're going to make decisions we don't. As a general rule, public libraries serve adults as well as children, and so the standard for what they're likely to carry is going to be different from school libraries. But it's a concern in public libraries just as it is in school libraries. And the solution is the same, which is there has to be some reasonable process that allows everyone to provide input and ultimately for democratic authority to rule.
Okay, so now anything I didn't ask about that you're
no, I think we've covered it really well. I mean, we did that analysis where we found that 74% of the PEN America banned books weren't banned at all; that they're actually there in the libraries. We did that analysis, and we wanted to get it out quickly, so we wrote it up as a Daily Signal article. But a full study version of that is in the works at Heritage and should be coming out in a little while. So
excellent. Okay, so we
will
share.
Your viewers there should keep an eye out for a more complete list. And we have, for example, an accurate top 10 list of what books have been removed, and they are all books that would look to most people like they contain content that might be objectionable. We do reproduce in the appendix of it images of the text, and people can judge for themselves. And I think that they would probably agree that these are things that people might reasonably object to. And none of the top 10 removed books or banned books according to PEN America that people would find more reasonable, like Bluest Eye or The Hate You Give, none of them are in the top 10 of actually banned books. So literature, for the widely respected works of literature, are for the most part not being removed from school libraries at all. It's mostly what a lot of people would think is porn or porn adjacent.
Adjacent.
I mean, look, I mean, like one of the works that's been removed is a book called Fun Home, which I've read, and there's a musical based on it, which I've seen, and I actually think it's a very interesting book and perfectly fine for adults to read. But you might not want to have it in school libraries. So I wouldn't want to say Fun Home is porn, although it does have visual depictions of sex acts, and because it has that, reasonable people could say, I don't think this should be in a school library. And that doesn't make them bigots. It doesn't make them homophobes. And it doesn't make them, Neanderthals who don't appreciate literature. It just means that they have some idea of what they think is appropriate for different ages.
Yeah. And I think also there's just a concern among, parents, regardless of their political stripe, about sort of this hypersexualization of children across the culture. Right. And also, increasingly in lessons in school that are required. And so it's almost like this is just like sort of another layer where I think people are just feeling like, can you just keep this away from my child? Can we stop pushing what feels like hypersexual content or just content that is sort of beyond their years? Like they're still putting their teeth under the pillow for the tooth fairy, and parents feel like they're also fighting a fire hose now of just very sexual content that they feel like it can wait.
Right. And for those parents who are convinced that their children are ready for it or who they think need it, they are perfectly allowed to go out and purchase it, or to go to their public library and get it there. The barriers are not that high. I mean, honestly, the only other thing I guess we should emphasize is how little usage there is of libraries in schools in the first. It's not as if I wish the kids were reading enough that they would actually, come across a lot of this stuff. So a lot of this controversy is not really about the brainwashing of children as much as it's about who's in control, who gets to decide what, how our children are raised. Do the unaccountable librarians get to decide, or do we as parents get to decide? And in a shared resource like a public school library, do we get to basically have input to a democratic process to decide? I think that's what the issue is really about. I don't think. Yeah.
And can we do that without being smeared and vilified as hateful people?
Right. I mean, actually, I think caring enough about our kids so that we want to raise them the way we want, with appropriate values, with age appropriate content. That seems to me to be something that we really should be praising. It's wonderful that parents are this concerned, this involved. And rather than demonizing these parents, as the media and left-wing organizations have been doing, we should be praising them for being such involved and caring parents. And that doesn't mean that every involved and caring parent cares in the same way that you do and has your values.
Correct.
They're going to make some decisions that you don't like, that you don't agree with, that you wouldn't do for your own kid. But they're allowed to raise their own kids just like you are.
It's kind of like we all remember the kid, like there was always the family where like they allowed the kid to see rated R movies, and then the kids that weren't allowed to see rated R movies.
Right.
And that was because the parents had made a different judgment call, which is exactly what parenting is about. Now I think it's parents feeling like, I don't want to feel like you're sneaking my kid into rated R movies during the school day.
Right. That's exactly right.
I want it to be my call. And and even within that category of rated R movies, right, there's always like, there might be one that they make an exception for, but you're not seeing the rest of them. And so it's just, I mean, as a parent of 3 teenagers, I feel like daily I see parents making different decisions and having, different opinions about things. And that's healthy and normal. And it's what it is to sort of be a pluralist parenting society. And that needs to be okay and celebrated, instead of deciding that this huge swath of parents that aren't okay with something are suddenly bad, evil people.
Right. Well, and also, it's dangerous to have a professional class of people who want to raise your kids.
Correct.
Right. They should raise their own kids and they should help you in raising your kids, but they can't displace you as the parent. And I think that's ultimately at the heart of what this controversy is.
I agree.
Is that there's a worldview where they think there's a class of professionals, highly trained professionals, librarians, educators, media elites, and they should substitute their judgments for yours. They know better how to raise your children than you do. That's how they think about things. And that's why they find it so objectionable that parents are raising concerns and disputing the decisions of these professionals. But, no matter how well trained and well intentioned those professionals are, they're still not the parents, and they don't get to decide. And they certainly don't get to decide in an unfettered, unchecked way.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Jay, now that everybody's seen you and decided that they love your smile and you're so smart and they want to follow everything else you do, how can they follow you and your work?
Sure. So I guess my Twitter handle's up there. You can follow me on Twitter. You can also go to the Heritage Foundation. The Center for Education Policy is where I can be found there. And I have lots of studies that are academic studies, but then also I write a lot of popular things, op-eds, and go on podcasts like this. And I work on a variety of issues, but honestly, it's mostly been on value disputes lately, which is, how it is that we raise our children and what character we wish them to have. I think this is a central part of education, and it's been a central focus of my work recently.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mention, but Jay is also kind of like a mega nerd, so he's like really good at research and study.
Well, that was obvious already.
And he uses words, all those words about variables and randomized control and all that stuff. But what's great about Jay is that then he puts it in article form in a way that regular people like me can actually understand it and then try to pass it along to you guys. So
yeah, well, I'm glad you think so. That's what I'm striving for. Again, I think that these value disputes, which are sometimes disparagingly called culture war, I think they're the most important thing in education. Education is primarily about the raising of children, and so we're gonna have to have fights about this stuff. So there's going to have to be a culture war every now and then, where we establish that ultimately parents are in charge. I think that's a world that we prefer at Heritage, and I suspect that Parents Defending Education is a world where the parents are ultimately in charge of raising their own children.
All right, Jay. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us for PDE TV. This has been awesome. And again, to everybody watching, you can follow Jay's work. If you are looking to get in touch with him, reach out to us and we can make that happen. And with that, I'm going to sign off and say thanks for joining us, everybody. And see you soon.
Thanks.